Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our event on North American Arctic Defense Cooperation. Thank you so much to Dr. Melody Birkins, the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies, for supporting this event, and to Sana Siddiqui for all the help on the back end. There's obviously a lot of news about Greenland right now, but we're really going to be taking the bigger picture with this event. We'll be taking a step back and thinking about the contemporary threat environment. What are the threats that we're facing to North America, and how, through cooperation, can we best deter and defend against those threats? And this is an especially timely event because we're coming up on the 25th anniversary of 9/11 this year, an event which had a dramatic transformation on the international security environment. And so to be here also today with our Canadian colleagues and with our colleagues from the Kingdom of Denmark is very timely because it just shows that our NATO alliance has been tested and has been proven. Our allies have shown up for us. The only time that Article 5 has been activated, the collective defense provision of the NATO treaty, was when the United States was attacked on 9/11. And our allies showed up, and the Kingdom of Denmark disproportionately had casualties because they would accept some of the most dangerous missions. The Canadians, on Tyndall Air Force Base's website, they have a whole page about the Canadians as the unsung heroes of 9/11 because of the ways that we were able to reroute over 30,000 passengers on flights to Canada and to very small communities where they didn't have the capacity in terms of hotels to bring people in. And so they actually brought people into their homes to be able to give them a place to stay while we were navigating this incredibly cataclysmic event. And at the time that 9/11 happened, I was just barely a teenager. I was in New York. And I remember, I think everybody who was around then remembers where they were. And it is such a comfort when you're totally caught off base by an incredible attack that you did not expect to occur, to have your allies who unquestionably will show up for you is not something that you want to take for granted. And it's something that I hope that all kids in the future would be reassured to know that their country, has the support of others. But, this is something that I think is really important to understand, not to be taken for granted, and that these relationships are so important. So with that, I'd like to hand over the floor to Iris Ferguson. She is currently the president of IAF Strategies, and she served as the first Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Arctic and Global Resilience at the Department of Defense, and actually stood up that office at the Pentagon. So I'll hand it over to you, Iris, for your introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marisol. Thanks, and great to be here amongst so many old colleagues and friends. I'm just going to jump right in. We have so much to cover today. On a big picture perspective, you asked me to speak a little bit about what the role of the Arctic plays for North American defense. And I think the fact that my office was stood up, that I had the privilege of standing it up, is a testament to the importance that the Department of Defense places and placed at the time in the region. It's strategic terrain. It still is. It's critical for missile defense. It's a place of power projection, especially for the Indo-Pacific. And really critically, it acts as a bridge between the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the United States. I'm going to give a couple of thoughts about where we were in the Pentagon when I was serving over the last 10 years, and then a couple of reflections on the current administration. But when I was at the Pentagon, we had a few assumptions. One, that the Arctic was becoming increasingly competitive, but that conflict was not necessarily inevitable. Two, that the region was changing rapidly and that it would continue to do so. A primary threat we saw was China. We saw that them trying to actively invest in the region, looking to influence governance in their favor. We've seen them deploy Coast Guard vessels and research vessels, and now even submarines, as reported by the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, up in the Arctic. These vessels are operating at unprecedented levels, and it's not necessarily for altruistic reasons, as that Wall Street Journal article points out. We've seen increasing investment and emphasis on the region from Russia. I know that Mike's going to dive into that in detail, so I won't belabor that. And we've also seen, importantly, especially for the Pentagon, increasing levels of collaboration between the two of them, especially on the Indo-Pacific side of the Arctic, where we've seen joint naval and aerial patrols. We've seen memorandums of understanding on deepening capabilities for the region, and then in developing the Northern Sea Route together. And of course, we noted that there was much of the changes that were occurring in the region were happening because of climate change, because the region is warming at 4 times the rate of the rest of the world. It's undeniable in this region. And we treated it as a security condition, definitely not as an environmental slogan. It was something that we needed to monitor so that we were able to operate effectively in the region. Our priorities for the department are not going to war in the region, keeping the region stable and peaceful. Second, we were really keen on deterring aggression and, of course, defending the homeland. That was our first and primary priority, and it still is in this administration, certainly. To that end, we were really emphasizing domain awareness in particular and focusing on the capabilities that we need to operate, looking heavily at communications, assets, and intelligence, and just improving our ability to show up and operate in the region when we need to. And then lastly, importantly for this audience and the other panelists, our strategy was really anchored in allies and partners. The Arctic is very hard, it's expensive, and luckily for the United States, our allies have exquisite capabilities that we often rely on and are learning from. We spent a significant amount of time engaging with all of our Arctic allies and partners. We created a specific forum called the Arctic Security Policy Roundtable to discuss Arctic security issues and collective capabilities. And we treated them with immense respect for the capabilities that they brought to bear. And I think that there's still so much opportunity that we can work on with them together to ensure our collective interests. So I'll shift a little bit now to talk about where I see this current administration placing emphasis on the Arctic region. There does seem to be a bit of a shift in tone from stability to one of advantage. There seems to be less concern about signaling restraint and more about signaling strength. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think deterrence is peace, and we certainly want peace. And nor do I think that tone is necessarily counter to our allies. But I do think that they want to be included in that strength because they are certainly a part of it. There's a lot of emphasis on the industrial base and economic opportunities. I think it's great that we're making some really long overdue investments, like the icebreaker investment for $8.6 billion, the recent announcement of Ice Pact with Canada and Finland, which is a continuation of an agreement that the Biden administration started. It's a landmark way of collaborating on capabilities that we need alongside our allies. I hope we're able to do more of those kinds of deals. The investment of $24.4 billion for missile defense and Golden Dome, that obviously has huge implications for NORAD and how we think about missile defense across the Arctic region. And then, of course, investments in critical minerals. I think it's important to note that it's still in the U.S. interest to keep the region stable. You can't go it alone within this region, and you can't have minimal compromising for this region. I think that might be possible in other parts of the world, but I just don't think it's possible in the Arctic. By nature, the Arctic is compromising. The operational reality forces cooperation. The elements, the operating conditions, the geographic reality are a huge wake-up call to that end. But at the same time, the U.S. has to also prioritize its own resources. And I think it's important for our Arctic allies to define what's important for them and to work to protect their own interests in addition to our collective interests. So I'm actually really encouraged to hear about recent announcements from Canada and Denmark and our other Nordic allies to amplify their capabilities for operating in the region. And before I close, I do think I'll jump on the Greenland grenade, Marisol. I think you and I's phone have been ringing off the hook over the last couple of days. But I've spent a lot of time working on Greenland, both as the former DASD for the Arctic, but also earlier in my Air Force career back when Pitifik was still Thule and there was no U.S. consulate in Nuuk, where the Air Force was sort of effectively the diplomatic presence for the United States. And I've had the privilege of visiting Greenland a number of times. So I want to say first, thanks to our service members that are serving in Greenland. I know they have immense respect for local Greenlanders. In fact, they just concluded the 66th Operation Santa Claus, where American, Danish, and Canadian forces save up all year to deliver Christmas gifts and even dog food for sled dogs to families in northern Greenland. It's a hardship tour for many folks, and they don't bring their families, and they keep watch for 24/7 over the threats that may be coming to the United States. So immense thanks for their service. And I also have deep respect for Greenland's geography, strategic value, and importantly, its history with the United States. And I think it's important to note that that history isn't uncomplicated. It's long been recognized as strategic in nature as the world's largest island. And during the Cold War, we had quite a few bases and infrastructure in Greenland. And we often built those sometimes without asking first. And that created a real trust deficit that lasted probably half a century. But in the past decades, the US, Denmark, and Greenland have really deliberately rebuilt trust through consultative forums and discussions and open dialogue about our intentions. I think it's great that Greenland's getting the attention it deserves for its strategic location, but I do think a couple of things need quick clarification. One, we have a really important treaty with Denmark from 1951, and it gives the US broad latitude to work on expanding our military footprint and needs almost at will. We have what we need from a treaty perspective. Two, when we hear about swarms of Russian and Chinese activity around Greenland, we need to be precise. China has showed strong interest and certainly still does have interest in Greenland, but much of that investment to date has been quelled through allied coordination. But where Russia and China are very militarily active is off the coast of Alaska. I hope we can spend a bit of time talking about Alaska and where the US does own significant personnel and have citizens and infrastructure to update. The last thing I'll note is the so-called use of strategic ambiguity. We've heard this frequently used around, will you deploy military operations? And you can think about it in the framing of Venezuela or Taiwan. I think strategic ambiguity can be useful when you're deterring an adversary, but it's potentially far less useful and arguably harmful when you're dealing with allies and partners whose cooperation you depend on every day. And you just look at the recent interdiction of the Russia Shadow Fleet in the North Atlantic near the Arctic, just happened a few days ago. That actually depended on UK territory for us to be able to conduct that operation. So the Arctic is a region where access, basing, and cooperation are truly everything for success. And so that kind of strategic ambiguity that we're hearing can very much undermine the very advantages that we're trying to protect. So thanks, Marisol.
Great. Thanks so much for that overview, Iris. You included a lot in a short period. So I do want to just touch on one of the points that you made for a brief follow-up question, because President Trump has said that he's concerned about this idea that there are Russian and Chinese vessels swarming around Greenland. From all the research I've seen, that just does not bear out. And it's really that it's off the coast of Alaska, as you mentioned. We're seeing, and that was one of the things that the Department of Defense's updated Arctic strategy identified, was that there is this increase both in the scope and the depth of Russian-Chinese cooperation militarily in the Arctic. From an Alaska perspective, since Alaska is what makes the United States an Arctic state, what are some of those investments that you think are really essential?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think it's important to clarify that there is military activity around Greenland. It's just not nearly at the same levels, I think, that we see in Alaska. So just to qualify that a little bit. But what I think is most concerning is where we have our own territory, Alaska, where we have immense military capability on the line. We have space situational awareness assets. We have F-35s. We've got large missile defense operations. We have our exquisite Arctic forces located in Alaska, and they are meant to deploy to the Indo-Pacific in the event of an emergency. They're also meant to protect our homeland if there is an incursion in North America. And so we really need to be focusing on where we're seeing threats in and around them. And we do see threats in and around Alaska, especially with this new collaboration that we're seeing with Russia and China, the joint naval patrols, the joint aerial patrols, the recent MOUs of understanding. I think we're seeing a deepening of the cooperation and a symbiotic relationship between them that we wouldn't have predicted 5 years ago. And that should bring alarm bells to a lot of people, but also to our Arctic allies and partners. So where I think that we need to be spending some time is thinking about what we need to be investing in Alaska. And I think infrastructure is front and center. To operate in the Arctic, you have to have infrastructure. As I was alluding to earlier, the access and basing is most critical in a region that is austere and very challenging to operate in. The recent reconciliation bill actually provided quite a plus up of infrastructure funding, $115 billion for the DoD to start thinking about Arctic infrastructure, including in Alaska. There's a lot of upgrade needs that need to happen, including maintenance on long neglected facilities. So I think there's huge opportunity there in addition to creating potentially some new forward operating locations. Obviously, the working with NORAD is really critical for upgrading our missile defense architecture. I hope that the Golden Dome funding is successful in identifying some new exquisite capabilities that we can co-invest in with allies and partners. I think if we need some of these capabilities to detect threats, certainly our allies do too. And if we can cost share some of that, that's a win-win for the American taxpayer, but also for our allies and partners and achieving new technology. And then beyond infrastructure and missile defense, we still need reliable communications in the north. We still need sensors to better detect threat patterns. We still need to work on unmanned platforms. So there's a whole host of things that I think we should be looking at for the Alaska region. But just to foot stomp that that's where we as the United States own territory, and that if we're really committed to ensuring and protecting our own homeland, that we should start where we have our own territory. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Iris. So Mike, we'll move over to you to get a deep dive into all things Russia. So I'll hand the floor over to you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Marisol. And I'll probably overlap a bit with Iris's comments. It's good to see all of you again on this call. So my comments will focus primarily on military security matters, since that's what I tend to specialize in. I think everyone who's been following the region knows that Russia has prioritized the Arctic for military investments over the last 2 decades. The Arctic features quite prominently in Russian military thinking, in numerous state policy and doctrinal documents, particularly for the Russian Navy, but also the aerospace forces and those concerned with Russian air and missile defense, and the strategic rocket force as well. From my point of view, the first order of concern from the United States remains homeland defense when we look at this region. It helps to look at the world a bit top down. We are separated by roughly 30 minutes of flight time for intercontinental ballistic missiles on a transpolar trajectory. I think we are undergoing yet another age of nuclear modernization today, if you're looking at Russian, Chinese, and US forces to an extent as well. And let's be honest, we're about 29 days out from losing the bulk of remaining arms control with Russia as New START treaty expires on February 6th. In recent years, Russia has deployed novel nuclear delivery systems on top of working to modernize its existing mix of ICBMs, road mobile ICBMs, sea-launched ballistic missiles, and air-launched cruise missiles. The latter are also all being modernized. In fact, we're seeing new versions of these systems being deployed and used against Ukraine. I'm speaking specifically about long-range air-launched cruise missiles. This all has implications for U.S. aerospace and missile defense, and having coverage of the Arctic remains a priority for the United States, as Iris spoke to just before me. The Arctic is home to Russia's largest naval fleet, the Northern Fleet, and its greatest complement of ballistic missile submarines. It therefore remains a priority for the U.S. Navy, and the Arctic remains a region with considerable undersea activity. Russian submarines go on long-range patrols from their bases in the Kola Peninsula via the GI-UK gap, and they are able to threaten U.S. seaboard cities as they operate in the Atlantic with sea-launched cruise missiles, which can be conventional or nuclear armed. Russia's strategic bomber forces do not require Arctic basing for refueling, as they did during the Cold War. They can launch at very long standoff ranges, not far from the Russian coast, against targets in the United States, also delivering conventional and nuclear armed missiles. And since the Russia-Ukraine war began, Russian production of cruise ballistic and quasi-ballistic missiles has increased considerably. In many cases, it is 3 times now what it was in 2022. Russian investments in the Arctic are designed to set up a series of air defense and missile defense pickets along a chain of islands, archipelagos, and what have you, and establish areas of zone control or effective denial where Russian forces can deploy air defense, coastal defense cruise missiles, and other capabilities that effectively control access to what Russia deems as the Russian Arctic. These are, of course, a primary concern to U.S. allies, but they're also designed to enable Russia to claim the Northern Sea Route as an internal waterway, which we and other states do not recognize. I think it's good that we also mention Alaska. In recent years, there's been increased Russian military exercise activity, especially off the coast of Alaska. One exercise in particular in 2020 caused quite a bit of disruption to fishing and other commercial activity. It's very frustrating for U.S. Fishermen. But the reason I bring this up is there's a notable increase in general in Russian-Chinese military exercises, defense cooperation, in what we consider the Arctic region. Finally, Russia also retains advanced underwater capabilities based on the Kola Peninsula, namely Gugi, the main director of deep sea research, and its fleet of specialized submarines, ships, undersea drones. This is a naval and intelligence entity that remains an important secondary concern alongside the Russian Navy. With respect to our allies, I'll touch on this briefly because we have colleagues from Europe who are going to follow on with their points. We have NATO regional defense plans now, and one of them certainly involves the Atlantic and Arctic region assigned to a command. With the addition of Sweden and Finland, our commitments in the region have only expanded. We've gained 2 great allies, but in practice, NATO has also acquired an additional 800 kilometers of frontage with Russia. This has remained a difficult area for the United States to access, to operate in, and it requires regular training on our end to make sure that we can fulfill those commitments to our allies and that we are credible in our ability to show up in a timely manner in this region. It is a treadmill that we have to constantly run on because it's a challenging environment to operate in, as Iris said. Now, Russian formations in the Arctic, if we look at ground forces, may appear to have been depleted over the course of the Russia-Ukraine war. That's the conventional wisdom. I've read this written many times. This is not the case. In actuality, the Russian military has expanded considerably in size. It has gone from 850,000 personnel to maybe 1.2 or 1.3 million. There are more armored fighting vehicles in the Russian army now than there were before the war, and there are far more precision strike capabilities along with new types of units and formations. As someone who does field work in Ukraine and who operates sort of near the front line on a regular basis, I think a lot of folks who look at other parts of the world or regions don't really see the Russian military there so much anymore because so much of it is in Ukraine, but they have to keep in mind that it's going to return to those bases and it's going to look quite differently than it did before the war. It's clear now that the Russian military is going to reconstitute much faster than expected after this war. Increased Russian defense spending as a share of GDP and as a share of Russian defense budget is a secular trend. It will not go down considerably. And the overall size of the Russian military and its magazine depth will be quite larger after this war than it was before. Russia has also expanded its campaign targeting critical infrastructure in Europe, from undersea cables to drones being flown over various European sites. And this is not to include the regular, already long-standing problems having to do with Russian jamming, especially in the Arctic and areas like that, which interfere with navigation communications. To some extent, I think we are seeing, particularly in 2025, we saw a growing horizontal escalation from the Russia-Ukraine war, and it's leading to increased Russian activity across Europe to include this region. And finally, this will be my last point, I think we should prepare for the inevitable rubber band effect of military activity once the Russia-Ukraine war is over. Most Russian NOTAMs, most exercises in the region are now in the Barents Sea, not so much in the Norwegian Sea, as used to be common. But we will probably see a substantial return of Russian forces, Russian military operations and exercises, and much greater brinksmanship to the Arctic region once the Russia-Ukraine war ends, or at least reaches some sort of pause. And this will come at a time when the United States is prioritizing homeland defense and China, looking for Europeans to take on a much greater share of the burden for managing security on their own continent. And we still do not know where the U.S. posture review is going to land or where the national defense strategy is going to land, which are important, I think, to some extent, guiding documents, much more so than the national security strategy. Okay, and with that, I'll turn it over back to you, Marisol.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. That was a really great overview. And then I think I also forgot to fully introduce you. So that was Mike Kofman, who is at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. And So Mike, I just do have a quick follow-up question for you in terms of like how the US and Canada and others are thinking about Golden Dome. When people ask you about this, kind of what are your thoughts on how we should be thinking about that, or and the way that things like NORAD and other capabilities would be part of that?
Look, I mean, I think what's been said about Goldom, of course, is incredibly ambitious, and the timelines are profoundly, from my point of view, unrealistic. But nonetheless, it does represent a strong U.S. investment in missile defense, right? Essentially, a layered network of missile defense that the U.S. will hope to establish over time. I think it's to me, I'm no expert on Golden Dome, but to me, it's more of a vector. There's a trajectory for U.S. defense tech investment and where we want to go, rather than necessarily a destination. So when I look at the various timetables and things that are out there, they don't look realistic to me. But nonetheless, it makes sense as a corollary to the current period that we're experiencing, the evolution of both precision strike abilities of our principal adversaries, Russia and China, and the second nuclear modernization age I spoke to, and the fact that we are soon to have almost nothing in the way of traditional arms control that we had and inherited from the Cold War period, and then been seeking to maintain.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much. So now I think it makes sense logically, speaking about NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, which is the only binational military command of its kind between the United States and Canada, that has responsibility for North American aerospace and maritime warning and aerospace control. So we'll head over to Canada now, to our two Canadian speakers. And first we have Gaëlle Rivard Piché, who is the current executive director of the Conference of Defense Associations, CDA, and the CDA Institute, and who had previously worked at NORAD Command in Colorado for the Canadian DND. So Gaëlle, I'll hand it over to you for a Canadian big picture perspective here. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisol. It's really a pleasure to be here today with you all and to share a little bit of the perspective. So I'm going to actually stay a little bit away from the NORAD modernization issue and leave it to my colleague Andrea. But I want to talk a little bit more about how the Canadian posture in the Arctic has changed and ought to change in the coming months and years, given the evolution of the environment. So I'd say that Canada finds itself in a really challenging position at the moment. The rhetoric and the events around Greenland this week are just one new example of that. But I would argue that our Arctic posture hasn't changed as fast as the environment has evolved, and our capacity to safeguard the region is not on par with where it ought to be, and for our ability to be a credible and reliable ally, I would say, both to the United States as well as to our European and NATO allies. And that's, I would say, the result of two important trends. First, over the last 5 years, the threat landscape in the North American Arctic has worsened. We've talked about an increase in Russian bombers skirting the North American airspace, but we've also seen an increased presence of drones. Mike has covered the advancement in terms of cruise missile and hypersonic weapons and ballistic threats coming from Russia. But most importantly, when it comes to threat in the Canadian Arctic, I think what we've seen is a growing foreign activity in the Canadian North and its approaches that are undermining Canadian sovereignty in the region. And as a result of that, and some of the examples, of course, we've all seen the incident with the Chinese research balloon, but the Canadian government has also recovered Chinese research buoys. There's some clear indication of dual purpose activities that are conducted under overt research activities by Chinese research vessels. We've also seen some risks of instances of disinformation and foreign interference at the local level in local communities, indigenous communities and northern communities. And all of that all of those activities, I would argue, are really occurring at the gaps and seams of our ability, the Canadian ability to safeguard our North. And as a result of that, we find ourselves more and more vulnerable in the region. And I would argue that the Canadian population is not fully aware of those risks, and the conversation around Arctic security and Arctic defense still focus on, the Russians invading our northern regions. But that really shows, I think, a clear lack of understanding and a lack of sophistication in the comprehension of the threat. And then the second trend that is really important, I think, is since January 2025 and how the Canada-US relationship has evolved, right? We've seen clear economic tensions around the trade discussions, and then Trump comment about the 51st stage, which really speaks to our inability to defend our territory without US security guarantees and without, outside of, I would say, a binational approach, and the lack of clarity and predictability of US policy under the Trump administration. And that has all generated a lot of backlash in Canada that has really taken, I would say, a lot of the oxygen out of the room and out of the debate. And so it puts us in a very difficult position strategically because we cannot change our geography, right? And that anti-American sentiment, I would argue, in Canada has led to a lot of friction. But the reality is that we can change our position, and continental defense will still need to occur with the Americans. But at the same time, Canada needs to be able to show that we have the capabilities to do so. And then on top of that, with the event around Greenland this week, we're really seeing that the US is appearing less and less inclined to act as a security guarantor, and it's creating and leading really to this need for us, for Canadians to, I would say, reinvest in defense and to show that we can be, as I said, a credible and reliable ally. One of my concerns generally is that the conversation around Greenland right now, and just generally about the change in the US posture, is creating a lot of strategic distraction, which is actually creating opportunity for our adversaries, for China and for Russia, I would argue, at least in terms of advancing their own interests at our expense. So where does it lead us in terms of in Canada, when it comes to Canada and its Arctic? I think that, as I said, for Canada to be a credible ally to the US, but also to our European allies, we must be able to defend our own land and start really show that, and it starts with the Arctic, right? And following back in June, we announced that we were increasing defense spending to 2%, and then later that month, at the NATO summit, to 3.5%, which I would say is a significant is a big signal. So for this year, we will increase defense spending by March 2026, by the end of March 2026 to 2%. That's $9 billion. There's a lot of skepticism, I will tell you, around our ability to actually deliver on that for the Canadian government, the Canadian Armed Forces, to be able to absorb that kind of investment, given the dire state of our military and the lack of readiness. And that means actually that reinvestment in the Canadian Armed Forces is really just about getting us to a level of readiness where we would be able to face the current environment. But as I said earlier, the environment is evolving at such a pace that I'm actually afraid that those investments will not come in time with to keep pace with the threat environment. And so most of the investment, for example, in Arctic capabilities and in NORAD modernization, the timeline is well into the 2030s. Yet, as Michael pointed out, when we talk about Russia reconstitution, we're talking about 2029, and then when we talk about China or a potential conflict over Taiwan, the timelines are actually, the earliest timeline are April 2027, which is only 15 months away. So I think ultimately that means that I think for Canada, yes, we've seen signals that we're moving into the right direction with a lot of investment in Arctic capabilities, but I'm worried those will not happen soon enough. And so there's a clear need, I think, for Canada to be a reliable and a credible ally, to accelerate how we're investing in Arctic capabilities, and to really show up basically and which will ultimately, and I think by contributing at home to national defense, it will make us more able to contribute to collective security as well as to, and to be, as I said, a credible ally. So I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you so much, Gaëlle. So I know you've testified before Parliament recently, and so, when you're advising on, okay, how do we kind of reconcile the issue with the time frames, right, to be modernizing, to have the capabilities that we need, when you think about filling that gap, what do you have any recommendations in terms of immediate prioritization or ways, even that we can be cooperating more internationally to help with that gap?
Well, a few of those measures, I think it's really, especially with the Americans, because I think one of the big issues is our inability to defend Canada against a ballistic attack or a missile attack. We are basically a lame duck, which is ultimately will affect our ability to be a credible ally. So, for example, Russia, in case of a conflict in Europe or an escalation in Europe, Russia could hold Canada at risk. And so I think in terms of priority, it's really about investing in our sovereign capability to defend, for national defense in Canada. How this is going to be done is very challenging because we're a huge country with a small population. And so the Golden Dome, or this idea of a dome over North America or over Canada, doesn't necessarily make sense, but it would be, in our case, more pointed defense. So that's one of the first conversation. But we've always, and I think the first step for us in Canada, it's really about engaging the population and to get the population to understand the environment in which we are. Because even when it comes to the polar OTHR, the new sites have been announced, but there is local incomprehension and I would say opposition to some of those sites because we don't, the common understanding or the popular understanding of the threat is not there yet. And so people don't understand why those investments should happen. And I think the first step towards us getting where we need to be is to actually get the Canadian population on board. And that is actually not going to be an easy task, but it should be the first one, because if we want to see sustained investment in defense, we will require Canadian support.
Yeah, that's a really important point, I think, about the strategic communication aspect. And then just for any viewers who aren't clear, OTHR is over the horizon radar. All right, so let me pass the baton over to Andrea Charron. So Andrea is the director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba. She's also a professor there, and she literally wrote the book on NORAD called NORAD in Perpetuity and Beyond. And so Andrea, it'll be really great to hear from you with kind of a deep dive on NORAD and where you see it going in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. I want to start by saying that Canada and the United States have moved far beyond the original 2011 vision of a simple one-for-one replacement of the North Warning System when it comes to NORAD modernization today. Today, it's really a shorthand for a comprehensive rethink of continental defense, and billions of dollars have been allocated, and we now have policy to support more than a dozen initiatives. So I want to highlight 4 projects and decisions related to NORAD and the Arctic, and then I want to raise 3 areas to watch for the future. So just as a reminder, the North American Aerospace Defense Command's 3 missions are aerospace warning and control and maritime warning. And they are the front line of defense for North America because the major threat vector to attack the United States is over the Arctic Ocean, and the likelihood of a direct conflict between the US and one of its 4 principal adversaries is increasing. Radars in Canada have provided advanced air and missile warning for more than 67 years. Because the NORAD Command is a binational agreement that was signed in perpetuity in 2006, there isn't the political scrutiny of the relationship that there once was, and the higher profile US Northcom mission sets are more likely to get the attention of the Armed Services Committee in the United States. The fraternity and the sorority of the uniform of NORAD remains strong. There is high confidence in General Guillau's leadership, and there has been absolutely no hint of NORAD billets being cancelled or altered. NORAD and continental modernization really continues apace in Canada. The projects are a combination of new capabilities, infrastructure, campaign footing, a war-fighting mindset, and adoption of a cloud-based command and control system. I'm going to highlight 3 of those projects and an important Canadian decision. The first is the NORAD Northern Basing Initiative, or the NNBI, which focuses on 3 forward operating locations in the Arctic, which are Inuvik, and that is the top priority because of its location, in Yellowknife and Iqaluit, and Goose Bay, which is a deployed operating base. There are 50 plus sub-projects associated with the NNBI. Common to all forward operating locations are fuel facilities, power grid modernization projects, operations facilities, multi-use facilities, information management, and IT upgrades, and munition storage facilities. When it comes to Inuvik, it will have a multi-platform hangar and a strategic tanker transport capability hangar. Given the remote locations of the forward operating locations in particular, completion of these projects will take at least a decade. The second project concerns the new radars for increased surveillance in the Arctic. The first is the Arctic Over-the-Horizon Radar System that will be based in southern Ontario. The Australian Jindalee system has been chosen. Cross-training between the CAF and Australian military will begin shortly, and the Arctic Over-the-Horizon Radar System will provide wide area surveillance capability to enable long-range situational awareness to NORAD and other force employers in the Arctic region. One site in southern Ontario has been confirmed, but the other still needs to be confirmed. This Arctic Over-the-Horizon Radar System will extend surveillance out towards the GIUK gap. The other related system, it was formerly called the Polar Over-the-Horizon Radar System, but is now called Northwatch, and it will extend surveillance coverage over the pole and will likely be a layered system with ground and space-based systems. This, however, will not likely come online until 2032. And finally, to the decision. Minister of Defence McGuinty announced on the 16th of July 2025 that Canada would explore air and missile defence capabilities. This has removed a barrier Canada had to participate in the U.S. mid-course ground-based ballistic missile defence system. This now opens the door for ongoing talks about integrated air and missile defence, Golden Dome, Canadian systems, and Canadian contributions. And now to the 3 areas to watch. Although Canada's Arctic receives significant attention due to the vast distances involved and lack of infrastructure, I believe greater focus should be placed on the Alaskan NORAD region, particularly since the only observed Russian and Chinese joint missions outside of the Russian Arctic have occurred in the Bering Sea and near the Aleutians. If we imagine the Arctic threats to North America as positions on a clock face, the sector from 9 to 9:30 warrants increased scrutiny. Additionally, achieving shared situational awareness between NATO and NORAD in the Arctic remains an ongoing objective and a work in progress. And lastly, ensuring NORAD can rapidly scale up and sustain operations over extended periods of time, spanning several days or even weeks, remains a critical area to monitor. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrea. One of the pieces that you touched on briefly, but I think is quite significant, is the change in Canadian policy about formerly the non-participation in ballistic missile defense. Can you speak a little bit more to that and how Canada is thinking about that?
Well, as Iris rightly pointed out, any discussion about integrated air and missile defense includes NORAD because of its mission sets, especially its aerospace warning mission. And of course, NORAD has a global area of operations. It's not restricted to an area of responsibility. And so that's a huge advantage. And so I understand that negotiations had started because of some of the tension between Canada and the US. This has thrown a little bit of a spanner in the works, but certainly Canada is thinking about the importance of integrated air and missile defense, where it can continue to work with the United States, because the functional logic that was the driver for why Canada and the US jointly defend North America still holds. And so the idea that there would be a golden dome, which General Gaëlle really envisions as sort of three layered shields, that those would be separate and apart from the warning and control missions that Canada aids with, it is just, it sort of defies physics. So there has been talk about Canadian continental dome, so to speak, but it will be a combination of integrated systems, very much layers. But one of the things that Canada does need to think about is point defenses. And this is not Arctic specific, but the fact that North America is hosting FIFA in a few months, and the importance of having things like no-fly zones in place, which is Operation Noble Eagle, and making sure that we can protect the people that come to North America, means that this needs to be a national security priority, and this is going to require point defenses, and NORAD will be heavily involved in the protection of those games.
Thank you so much for that, Andrea. Okay, so now let's pivot over to our colleagues in the Kingdom of Denmark. So the Kingdom of Denmark, for those who aren't familiar, is a commonwealth of 3 countries. You have Denmark, you have Greenland, and you have Faroe Islands. And they are sovereign countries that could make decisions for themselves. So let me hand this over to John Rahbek-Clemmensen. He is the head of the Strategic Studies section at the Royal Danish Defence College, also an associate professor there. And he'll provide an overview of the history of the relationship between Greenland, Denmark, and the U.S. Within the context of defense cooperation and some of the changes that will be coming online. So, John, over to you.
Well, thanks a lot, Marisol, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. I have to start with the caveat, because I work for the Danish military, that everything I say is my own analysis and my own opinion. I do not speak on behalf of the Danish Ministry of Defense or any other Danish agency. Generally speaking, I want to echo a lot of the arguments that have already been made by some of the speakers, but perhaps a little bit more from a Danish perspective. And I want to make 2 arguments. The first argument is that Denmark is increasing its defense presence in the Arctic radically. Denmark passed 2 agreements in 2025 that enhance defense spending in the Arctic and the North Atlantic by $6 billion. So, in spite of what some people are saying, this is not just a dog sled. Some of these investments involve or entail the purchase of several new patrol vessels, maritime patrol aircraft for anti-submarine warfare, radars to enhance domain awareness in East Greenland, long-range drones for domain awareness, especially in the maritime domain, investments in special forces, investments in military recruitment and education, and involvement of the Greenlandic community, and a new headquarters for the Arctic Command in Nuuk. And if I were to summarize what all these investments are about, I would highlight 3 core activities. So these investments are supposed to enhance Denmark's ability to provide aerial and maritime domain awareness in Greenland and in Faroese waters and on the Greenlandic and Faroese territory. Secondly, they are meant to enhance Denmark's ability to participate in anti-submarine warfare activities, especially in the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. So actually not in Greenland or in the waters of the Kingdom of Denmark, but rather in that area going towards Great Britain and going towards Norway that Mike Kofman talked about before, where we could see enhanced Russian activity going forward. And then thirdly, these investments are about building resilience in Greenlandic and the Faroese society by enhancing the redundancy of capabilities such as internet cable and internet infrastructure, but also it's about building awareness about the threat and knowledge about the threat in those communities. So broadly speaking, I think there's a lot to gain from collaboration with allies for the Kingdom of Denmark. And one example I just want to highlight is that I think especially Canada can provide inspiration for the Kingdom of Denmark, because Canada, in just to mention one specific domain, Canada has been a front runner when it comes to the involvement of local and indigenous communities in defense activities, for instance, through the so-called Canadian Rangers. And here I think that Denmark could really learn a lot from collaborating with its Canadian allies going forward. So that was my one argument. There's been a lot of investments, and it opens all kinds of strategic and tactical opportunities for allied collaboration going forward. My second argument, I think, or I want to make in light of some of the events of the past week, I really want to highlight that the current setup within the Kingdom of Denmark is very advantageous for the United States. The United States does not need, in my opinion, political control over Greenland in order to reach its geopolitical ends on that island. The US basically wants to do three things in Greenland, right? It wants to have access to Greenland's military geography. It wants to have access to some of the strategic minerals, such as rare earth elements that you can find in Greenland. And it wants to keep China out of Greenland. But the current arrangement already gives the US access to Greenland's military geography. And if there's something that the US wants to do militarily in Greenland that it can't do within the current agreements, and I have a hard time seeing what it actually should be, but if there's something that the US wants to do, Denmark and Greenland are very open for dialogue about that, and I think that should be relatively easy to do. And the same thing goes for minerals. The US and Greenland already have an agreement about collaboration in the rare earth and minerals domain, and Greenland is very open for business when it comes to natural resources. And then finally, keeping China out of Greenland, as I'm sure everyone knows, there's no Chinese presence in Greenland today, and Chinese actors don't really show an interest in Greenland and haven't done so for at least the past 5, 6, 7 years. Maybe there are a few things that can be done to close the door further for China in Greenland, but once again, I think that would be doable to do within the current arrangement. And actually, the current arrangement allows the United States to have its cake and eat it too, because the US gets its geopolitical interests, while at the same time sending the bill for running Greenlandic society to the Greenlandic taxpayers and to the Danish taxpayers. If the US were to gain political control over Greenland, I believe that there wouldn't really be a geopolitical upside to it. You would only get the bill, which is quite significant. So just to sum up, I think there's significant prospect for allied collaboration, and the states have a lot to gain from keeping a focus on the practical challenges and opportunities facing the alliance, to the concrete military threats. So in that sense, I really want to reiterate what Gaëlle said before. that if we can avoid distractions, there's really a lot of low-hanging fruits. And I really hope that the dialogue will be about how we can actually identify and pick up those fruits.
Great. Thanks so much for that overview, John. Really appreciate it. And so I think there's a couple just really important points to just kind of foot stomp here. So like, first of all, that we have the 1951 Defense Agreement. We updated in 2004 the Gaëlle Agreement, right? And in all of these documents, there is explicit recognition of sovereignty, right? And of, especially before the 2009 Self-Government Act of Greenland, that we, the United States, were recognizing Greenland as a part of the Kingdom of Denmark. So this, you only have to go back through literally any of our historical documents to see that there is not a question there about the U.S. recognition of that sovereignty. And as you mentioned, of course, we have the permanent committee for any defense concerns that we might have, and I think the subsea cable for redundancy is so important as we are really grappling in the Arctic more broadly with attacks on subsea infrastructure, and just that the real and obviously the Finns are really dealing with this a lot, with kind of that tension between trying to be able to immediately have a response and to be able to press charges, right? If it seems clear that there is some type of malign intent associated with this, but what we've seen before was really like the issue with having, a cable be severed, and then you have to launch a really long investigation in order to be able to determine, was this an actual, intended act or not? And that's so complicated. So having that redundancy is really important, for multiple reasons. And we even saw that in terms of Alaska, when due to just the ice that cleaved off a piece of the cable that then actually went, the subsea cable that actually went down to Nome, which is where the U.S. is building our deep water port to support U.S. military presence in Alaska and in that portion of the Arctic. So I think that's a really important aspect of this. Are there certain investments that you're seeing the Danes make? I mean, this billions of dollars, there's a lot here. Are there any in particular that you think are especially strategically significant as we're thinking about kind of the continental defense issue?
Well, I would really highlight the investments in maritime patrol aircraft for anti-submarine warfare as radically groundbreaking. I mean, I've been following that debate for years, and for years in Danish policy circles, we've been talking about like whether this investment would be necessary or not, and by making it now, I think that Denmark is sending a really significant signal that Denmark is going to enhance its capability in the anti-submarine domain, and that it's not only doing that in order to enhance its own territorial defense, but actually this is being done as part of a big allied effort where Denmark will collaborate with countries such as Norway and Great Britain, the United States, Germany and France, about that critical task of patrolling the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so let me hand the floor over to Rasmus, Leander, Nielsen. So we have the Kingdom of Denmark together in the same room. So Rasmus is the head of Nasiffik, the Center for Foreign and Security Policy, and is an associate professor at the Department of Arctic Social Science and Economics at Ilisimatusarfik, which is the University of Greenland. Rasmus, I'll hand the floor over to you. And I believe you have some slides as well, so we can get those posted.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Marisol. And I think since we started discussing whether we should have this seminar back in Reykjavik in October, things have gone a little bit more serious than we envisioned back then. Just very briefly about what. So I'm born and raised in Denmark, just to make sure that I'm not Inuit, and I've lived in Greenland for almost 10 years, working at the university in Greenland. And some 5 years ago, we also started a Center for Foreign and Security Policy called Nasiffik, which means outlook post, or place you go to look out in Greenlandic. We do have we're a small group of researchers, but we are very much focused on trying to explain Greenland's role in the world, and that is somewhat more complicated these days than normally. But we're trying to also explain that is the agency of Greenlandic foreign policy is actually something that has been developing quite interestingly over half a century. It's not something that just happened overnight. It's been in the making since the 70s, especially. We can go further back to the Second World War and the American bases, etc. I think it's very important that the agency of Greenland is quite substantial compared to other semi-autonomous entities. We do have projects related to that. There's quite a lot of journalists these days that want to ask about free associations models, etc. I won't go into that for now, but we also have projects related to having surveys to see what the Greenlandic population actually thinks about foreign and security, and I will have just one slide on that just in a bit. But also, as Jon mentioned, we do have some projects focusing on emergency preparedness. There's like a very interesting program in Gangerslusvak in Strømfjord that we also want to do some comparative works with the Canadian Rangers in Canada, and something that we have been working on for a few years, and something that we want to upgrade moving forward in this calendar year. And we also have some projects about alliance dilemmas that are also way more complicated than we actually got the money a few years ago. Next slide, please. So this is just to make an argument and say that the Greenlandic population is actually quite open for international cooperation. We did a survey back in 2021 and one again in 2024. I think it's quite important to say this is like the data collection, the timing of that happened before Ukraine and happened before the second version of the Trumbo deal of last year. So this is when we did do the survey, it was more like normal politics in Greenland rather than on the heightened tension of Ukraine and what is being stated from the US administration a year ago, and then a rerun just before Christmas of this year. And that's a clear sign that Greenland, or the Greenlandic population, especially want to collaborate more with its neighbors in Canada, in Iceland, the Arctic Council. It's seen as very, very important. And then Denmark, the EU, and the US is further down, like a second time. Then China and Russia is further down below in terms of who Greenland think we should collaborate more with. But I think there's some interesting aspect to this, that there's a very much openness to international cooperation, the Greenlandic population. Next slide, please. And just making one in terms of the topic that we're discussing this afternoon in Copenhagen, where you and I sit, and that NATO especially is seen in a very positive light in the Greenlandic population. There's been, if we go back to the 80s, NATO was not as popular, and there was quite a lot of op-eds in the Greenlandic news being critical about that. But especially when we in 2021 asked about whether the population saw NATO as in a positive light, we had 3 out of 4 Greenlanders saying no. And then in a recent survey from a couple of years ago, it was down to 2 out of 3, but still on a very high level of trust in NATO, and saying this is the most important security provider for the Greenlandic population. And we also have other questions that go into that as well. Next slide, please. And also want to mention that just 2 years ago, a quite interesting document came out from Naalakkersuisut, the government of Greenland, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Greenland, a strategy that was quite an expansion of an earlier strategy from 2011, a foreign policy strategy coming from Greenland. This is not to be conflicted with the Arctic strategy of the Kingdom of Denmark, but this is a Greenlandic document. There was a substantial focus on the North American Arctic in that document, and maybe also a tad too much on the US in collaboration with that, vis-a-vis if we compare to the EU or Western Europe. The thing that's quite an interesting openness in this document also to security, deterrence, and what has been going on the last 5 years, and especially in the Defense Act that is being negotiated with Copenhagen. Greenland has been much more involved in recent years in terms of, I think the DoD of Denmark has actually been one of the few success stories that's been much more engagement and collaboration with the MFA in Nuuk, and much more reliant or openness in Greenland to also having both security, deterrence, that's a focus on dual use, something that's for the benefit of the Greenlandic population as well. But I think there's been quite a large change in sentiments that deterrence is important. We can't just have high north low conflict. We also need to look into some of these things that are quite interesting. What is happening, what has been discussed most of 2025, that the document of this strategy is going to be reopened. It's not going to be a complete rewrite, but there is going to be some changes in the balances, saying maybe less focus on the US, more to the EU and Canada, because some of the complicated last year that we've been witnessing. I just want to mention that's something I took from, I had a what's called a quick impact from Nielsen, the Canadian network that I'm involved in with a lot of others, trying to sum up Greenlandic foreign policy in 3 slogans that are very much used by Greenlandic diplomats and politicians. And the first one was open for business, not for sale. That came in 2019 when Trump first time ventured his idea of buying Greenland. The second one is nothing about us without us, which is the subtitle of this strategy that I'm talking about. And the last one that came like a year ago, up to the parliamentary election in Greenland for Ilisimatusarfik in March of last year, that we don't want to be Danes, we don't want a new colonizer in the US. I think these 3 slogans sums up quite a lot of what's actually been going on. But as I mentioned, the strategy is being revised. There's quite a lot of the parliamentarians in Greenland saying that this should happen soon, but it's something that's being discussed, and there is no clear roadmap when this is going to happen. And now I think everybody in Nuuk is quite preoccupied with discussing Washington DC again. Next slide, please. And just to mention that was like, we only have to go back 1 month, that the yearly meetings in what is called the permanent committee and the joint committee between the US and Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark actually happened a month ago in Greenland, and there was quite a lot of focus. There was doorstep meetings with the US ambassador to Copenhagen was in Nuuk, and really trying to go back to it like a normalcy of rebuilding credible commitments and trust. And that's also, it seems pretty clear that Rubio is going to meet with the Kingdom of Denmark, including Greenland, Minister of Foreign Affairs, just next week. But yeah, it's things are very complicated once again. So we've pretty much been thrown back to a year ago to what was going on that. And I think I will keep it then and just show my last slide, please. Just mentioning that the diplomatic scene in Nuuk is actually quite interesting. The US reopened a consulate 5 years ago. I think they're having less coffee at the moment with local stakeholders at the moment, but it's very interesting that both France and Canada they were supposed to open a new consulate back in November, but because of bad weather, the Minister of Foreign Affairs couldn't fly to Nuuk. But from what I've heard, there's going to be an official opening next month in Nuuk. France is going to open a consulate as well. So we do see in Nuuk a diplomatic scene, including the Icelandic, who's been there for more than 10 years. The EU opened an office a couple of years ago, which is quite interesting. So it's not just foreign policy, Greenland flying to Washington or Brussels or wherever you go, but also you have the day-to-day diplomatic scene in Nuuk that I hope we can go back to some credible commitment building in the not too distant future. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Rasmus. So, I think it's really important to note, one of the things that you're saying about how Greenland is revising certain aspects of their Arctic strategy, their foreign policy, to be moving away a bit from the US in favor of moving more towards Europe and with Canada. I think it's really important for the United States to realize that even without using military force or some other coercive means to try to acquire Greenland, that there is tangible harm that is being that is happening in real time to this relationship. And it's quite ironic when you think about the whole idea being that, well, it's because we think you're important and our engagement with you is important, and that's why some of these tactics have been used, but really it takes it back to the need to have a level-headed assessment of, first of all, what's the state of play? What are the currently existing agreements? We talked about some of those with John, and you, Rasmus, spoke about the Permanent Committee, which is a dedicated forum for any type of defense considerations between the United States, Nuuk, and Copenhagen. And we have the Joint Committee to be focusing on, economic development, minerals, things like that. I think it's really important strategically for the U.S. to understand what actually advances the strategic interests that we're looking at securing, and what actually creates more roadblocks, because it doesn't, to me, make sense that it's advantageous if Greenland all of a sudden starts looking at U.S. presence or prospective investment with the same scrutiny that you guys look at the Chinese, right? This is not really something that's very constructive for, securing U.S. interests. And so one of the concerns that has also come up from the Trump administration is this idea that as Greenland is pursuing, becoming fully independent, that making sure that, you would remain militarily aligned, that's really important, from a U.S. perspective. And so there, I think it's important to note that, Greenland has now a seat at the Danish representation to NATO as of, I believe, 2023. So could you talk a little bit about kind of how Greenland is thinking about that on the kind of journey towards independence, and kind of what some of that future kind of the relationship might look like with Denmark, or with the United States? I think maybe clarifying some of that could be helpful.
Yeah, so there is a big independence movement in Greenland, but it's not very tangible, and it hasn't been for a long time what model of independence. So no one is talking about a North Korean style independence of just having no alliances, and that's a big wish to stay put in NATO, however that mean. And the most obvious model would still, to some extent or to a large extent, outsource the defense dimension of, like, Iceland model, where you have maybe a coast guard or you have collaboration with other partners, but Greenland would not have a standing army, so they would still have to rely on alliances and be part of NATO. If we go back just a few years ago, there was discussion whether it could be a free association model with Denmark or with Canada or with the US. And some of these discussions are mainly being taken by the only opposition party, NAA, in Greenland at the moment. So some of these discussion, what could be the next phase for Greenland, has been muted to some extent. That's still the long-term goal is still for some model of independence, or moving away from the status quo of what is in the Kingdom of Denmark at now. So my personal opinion is that we should do something we should change the status quo in the Kingdom of Denmark, because no one is really super happy about the arrangement we have now. But some of these discussions, what could the next step be, is not tangible at all, because the discussions are not really getting. There was a draft constitution published some years ago, and we were hoping that a more tangible discussion could come in furtherance of that, but that didn't really happen. So I think everybody thinks we should do something completely different, or not somewhat different to what we have now within the Kingdom of Denmark. I think that's also some voices that are starting to re-emerge in Torshavn, in the Faroe Islands. But it's very difficult to have that discussion when things are somewhat quite complicated at the point, because in terms of the US long-term goal, it's still the same, that we want to have close collaboration with the US. We actually want to promote trade and mining investments, because there's very little trade to the US nor Canada, and open for business, as the famous locals of 2019 said, that investments in terms of rare earth minerals is very much welcomed, and has been for years and years and years. That hasn't changed. So the long-term goal is still the same: close collaboration with our neighbors. It's just very complicated at the moment.
Thanks so much for that, Rasmus. So I also want to kind of zoom out a little bit. And so we've talked about, Russian and Chinese capabilities, just the fact that when NORAD was established, we did not have the hypersonic and ballistic missiles that we are now having to deal with. But then also kind of beyond the traditional ways that we think about defense, we are also, as Iris mentioned, dealing with pretty significant levels of environmental change. It's really not just climate change. I really am trying to get more people to use the planetary boundaries framework to really understand that our Earth is made up of complex interactive systems, and the climate is only one aspect of that. And so to really understand how environmental change intersects with the ways that we think about the threat environment is really complex, and really requires a different way of thinking, and really kind of transdisciplinary cooperation. But Iris, I want to just go back to you briefly, because you were the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Arctic and Global Resilience. And so you kind of spoke about the Arctic piece, but in terms of that global resilience part of your portfolio, how can you just kind of walk us through how you were conceptualizing that?
Yeah, absolutely. Just really briefly, Marisol, there was a question earlier in the Q&A on like why I emphasize Alaska. If I could just like address that really quickly, and then I'll move to the climate piece.
Please.
There's a question on why are you focusing on Alaska? Are Russian and Chinese activity really threatening? I think it's a valid point of, they're operating in international waters. But I think it's really important that we look at Alaska, one, because we got to open the aperture about the Arctic. It's a whole region. It's not just the European Arctic. The European Arctic is super important, don't get me wrong, but we also need to be looking at the whole, that there's a seam between NORTHCOM and INDOPACOM. I think the Russians and Chinese like to probe, it seems, to see if we can show up effectively. And to that end, on the Indo-Pacific side of the Arctic, there's not as many allies to call on, quite frankly, as there are in the European side. And I think it's worth recognizing that. And then if we're really, as a U.S., interested in U.S. interest, we are an Arctic nation because of Alaska. We have a lot of military forces there. And if our two primary competitors are choosing to operate there off the coast of Alaska, closer, they're operating with greater proficiency than anywhere else in the world, we should just be attuned to that. So I just wanted to address that question. Onto the global resilience side of the portfolio, yeah, it was truly global in nature and how we were thinking about the impacts of climate for the department. And I really want to put stomp again that this was a security condition. It was not an environmental slogan. This was about thinking about how militaries need to think about the changing environment, what they're being called to respond to, how it's impacting our operations and our equipment. And so it was very much a national security framing of climate issues. So our own forces were being called to respond to disasters at much greater frequency here in the United States. Our National Guards being deployed in far greater levels to disasters than we've been seeing before. Our first responders overseas are often militaries, and so our partners that are being called to respond to disasters are often our military members. So we're spending a lot of time talking with them about how to increase their resilience so that we don't have to be the ones that are responding, that they can help respond to disasters on their own. We were seeing heat impact our equipment dramatically. C-17s, for example, have much less lift in high levels of heat. If we're going to see increasing levels of heat, that means we can carry less stuff. Those are real operational security issues that we need to be thinking about, in addition to, of course, salinity changes from fresh water and ice melting that impacts sonars of submarines. And then from an energy perspective, the world is moving at pace to electrify, and the Department of Defense relies heavily on fossil fuels. And if we're not trying to keep up with how the world is modernizing, that puts us at a detriment. One of our biggest slogans was, "The militaries that best respond and adapt are going to have the edge," and that it also requires being attuned to what's happening in the commercial space, because, quite frankly, in a lot of the exquisite types of energy materials, especially batteries, for example, we don't have a huge market share. So really working with our allies and partners and understanding where the commercial market's moving and trying to have a case to be put forward for all of our allies to be investing in certain types of energy sources, like certain types of batteries, and standardization made a lot of sense. And so we spent a lot of time creating frameworks and developing analysis for how heat, like I said, for example, was impacting our equipment, but also how we're working with our allies and partners to assess new energy needs, what we need to be working on together, and where we need to have a keen eye towards interoperability so that we're not developing new technologies in silos.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Iris. So I want to give each of you a chance now just to have like 2 minutes of response to anything you heard that you want to respond to, or any kind of wrap-up remarks that you think are important to include to wrap up this session. So let me go. I'll just go over back to you, Iris, if you want to give your wrap-up remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll keep mine really brief. I think it's in the U.S. interest to keep the region stable and peaceful. I think it's in our collective interest to do so. Going to war in the Arctic would be really, really incredibly challenging. And really, for the U.S. interest, we need to be working hand in hand with our allies and partners, because it's a really complicated region, and there's a lot to benefit when we operate together.
Great, thank you. And John, over to you.
2 seconds. Yeah. Well, I just wanted to answer a question that a great question that was made in the Q&A, where someone asked if it would be possible to go back to the situation that we've had previously. How much damage has been done to the relationship between Denmark, Greenland, and the US over the past year, I guess. And I think it's important to emphasize that there has been a loss of trust. And I thought about it the other day that a few years ago, if the US had announced that it wanted to increase its presence in Greenland, I think it would have been welcomed by the Danish, and actually also most of the Greenlandic defense and foreign policy establishment. But now, because of the situation we've had right now, there will be this lingering worry that, is this a precursor for something more nefarious? And if you look at polls about the alliance relationship with the US, you've seen a very significant decrease in public trust in at least US-Danish relations. However, that being said, I think there's a real appetite for normalization, with at least within this country, and I believe also within Greenland. So I actually think that even though there's been a lot of damage to the relationship, I actually think that if we could move the conversation, as several of the speakers today have highlighted, if we could move the conversation to the concrete challenges that we face, and these are very serious challenges, because as the war in Ukraine might wind down, we might see an enhanced Russian activity in the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap and elsewhere in the Arctic. But if we could focus on those challenges, I actually think that that could be a really important step in the right direction. And even though it would be complicated, I actually think that we could move the debate that way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks, John. So Mike, let me pass it over to you for any closing thoughts that you have.
Sure. Maybe briefly to tackle some of the questions in chat regarding Russian economy. So Russian economy is currently stagnating, but if the question regards the future of Russian armed forces, yes, they will be able to sustain a rather large military moving forward. It's just not clear where that force will stabilize after the Russia-Ukraine war. But Russian military constitution is not an if, it's simply a debate on when, and that debate is a narcissism of small differences between those who think it might take a few years versus 5 years versus 7 years. In defense planning, 10 years or less is a very short planning timeline. And so we have to look to the future security environment in Europe because it's rapidly approaching. I think for European allies and colleagues, well, they find themselves to a fairly important trend, right? Russia remains the primary revisionist power on the continent. It holds about 50% of the Arctic if you look at coastline and geography. It is one of the leading Arctic powers. Its military will reconstitute much faster, and many of those forces will return to their bases in the Arctic region, and military activity will increase after the Russia-Ukraine war. And the country that has the leading role for managing European security, the United States, is increasingly less interested in that role and is prioritizing very clearly homeland defense. And China, the latter has been a secular trend in U.S. strategy for over a decade. But Europe at the moment is not in a position to take over management of European security. It certainly won't be in the near term or in the medium term. That is also the reality. We can't simply hand the ball off to them. As much as we would like them to get there, this remains an aspirational capability. We have to continue working together. And I think, unfortunately, the issue of Greenland, which I'm not an expert on compared to everyone else here in the conversation, but has shifted the Arctic to some extent from an area of considerable cooperation between us and European colleagues to one of some disagreement and distrust. And hopefully we can at some point recover from that. So I will leave it at that. Like I said, I focus on military and security matters, and I think European security remains to be an area where there's much to be done, and it's an area that we are going to have to work together between the United States and European colleagues.
Thanks so much for that, Mike. And I think actually you're making me think about something that I've thought about a lot recently, which is also that if the United States is saying to Europe and Canada that, we want you to take more responsibility for your own defense, and as Europe is really grappling with, the increase in Russian aggression and the prospects that this will get more intense, in the coming years, that it's really a distraction when then members of the alliance have to contingency plan for a potential ally invading them, right? This is taking time, energy, resources, personnel away from being able to hyper focus on countering Russia, on understanding China, right? And so that's something that I think is really important for the U.S. to also understand, that in a way we're getting in the way of Europe and Canada's ability to do what we are asking them to do by doing that. So, Mike, I see you raise your eyebrows. Is that an agreement eyebrow, or is that what do you think?
Yeah, I would say to me the overall issue, the way at least I think about it, is that credibility is born off of consistency in behavior and demonstrate commitment to your allies. And when you see profound disagreements amongst allies, and disagreements amongst allies and alliances certainly happen like this, it doesn't bode well for the perceptions of the alliance. And on a fairly regular basis, I think in Moscow, folks ask themselves, to what extent is the United States interested in maintaining its role in managing European security? And to what extent is the United States, which is the principal military power within NATO, not all military power in NATO, but nonetheless the main power in NATO that concerns the Russian armed forces, to what extent is that military going to show up in a contingency, whether it's in the Baltics, whether it's in the Nordic states, whether it's in the Arctic, and can they expect, could they count on a robust U.S. military response, right? And I think, to me, the answer right now is yes, but certainly for many European allies and colleagues, the question increasingly is maybe, right? And that's where the concern lies.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let me go over to you, Andrea, for any closing thoughts that you'd like to offer.
Hi, thanks very much. I've responded to a few of the questions, but it strikes me that on February 13th, 2017, then President Trump and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau sort of announced this bilateral commitment to modernizing NORAD and continental defense. At the time, there were very few details and even fewer funds committed. But today, what we're seeing is a generational investment in NORAD and continental defense. But that doesn't mean that NORAD can't be marginalized out of existence. And while NORAD is still working well, the spillover from tariffs and strained economic relations with Canada and the United States can undo this momentum. It's amazing to me that before this latest Trump presidency, we could insulate issue areas. So if there was a tension within NORAD, that would stay within the NORAD bucket. It wouldn't necessarily transfer to economics and vice versa. But that has changed. And my big concern is that trust is quickly lost and really difficult to rebuild. And so I think, this event, thank you for organizing it, because I think it's really important for to understand the complexity of the situations and get some facts inserted into the conversations.
Thanks so much, Andrea, and just really appreciate your contributions and everybody's contributions here. It is very important. So I'll give the last two speakers, Rasmus and Gaëlle. I just want to also say thank you so Rasmus, as the head of Nasiffik, as one of our co-sponsors of this event, and Gaëlle as the executive director of the CDAI. Really appreciate your partnership in this. And so I'll hand it over to you, Rasmus, and then we'll go to you, Gaëlle, for the last word.
Just two brief points. What we actually did see back in summer of last year was some of the NATO exercises were done by the Joint Arctic Command of the Danish defense, but in close collaboration with some of the European partners, with France, with Germany. We had quite a lot of activity in the summer in Nuuk. In terms of that, we also had some collaboration with some of the from Nasiffik, some of the Center of Excellences in Europe and in Canada. So in Montreal with the climate security nexus, but also so high mountain operations in Slovenia. So I also wanted to convey to a Greenlandic audience some of the day-to-day work that NATO is actually doing quite well and still are doing quite well. And then, like a historic anecdote would be my closing remarks. So I think we have been mentioning the defense agreement between the Kingdom of Denmark and the US going back to the 40s and 50s. There's some slight amendments in the 90s, and then the Gaëlle agreement in 2004, where Greenland, more to the point, got involved. But there is this reading that the US actually have a lifelong lease of Pituffik, of Thule air base as long as they wanted, but it's actually tied up to NATO membership. So we have this weird conversation whether the US will actually lose Pituffik space base if they choose to not be part of NATO anymore. We have so many weird dynamics and counter dynamics in terms of should we start an Article 4 process in terms of some of the signals that are coming from the US, but the base lease that we thought was for the next couple of 100 years is actually something that we should also look into, because that could be the end of Pituffik space base, but it's not in the interest of Greenland, because we need that deterrence that is really, really important from the US. So this is quite complicated, drawn in with some historical, colonial defense dynamics that we're still grasping with to understand. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really important to point out. So thank you, Rasmus. And I also do want to note that over the last 48 hours, we have seen bipartisan statements from members of Congress in the United States speaking out about how critically important the NATO alliance is to U.S. interests, and that as the U.S. is thinking about its security posture and the priorities of the administration, that in no way should that be compromised, because we do gain so much from that. And I think the evidence bears that out well. So now let me hand the floor over to Gaëlle, let you give us our last words.
Thank you, Marisol, and thank you for associating the CDAI to the event. It was really a pleasure to be with you all today. I just want to comment on two things. John pointed out to, hoping for normalization in the relationship, within the alliance. As much as I think we can hope for it, I would say that the last year is showing us that we should not expect it. I don't think the Trump administration is looking to normalize relationship. And although the results of the midterm election could change that, or could influence a little bit, or affect the ability of the Trump administration to maneuver. But I think this is a moment for us, for NATO members and NATO countries and allies to actually step up and adopt, I would say, a more mature posture, strategic posture. And investing in our own defense has some clear implications for Arctic security and defense. And I think even especially at the domestic level, but also at the regional level. And I would just want to, and I think there's a question about critical minerals that I think is interesting. And while there was an agreement, and then that speak to that, while there was an agreement under the Biden administration, between DOD and the government in Canada on critical minerals, I don't think the current climate with the tensions around the renegotiations of CUSMA will allow for that. But I think this is a great moment to actually see investment in our Arctic as a way to secure it and to better safeguard it. And so from a Canadian standpoint, this is a great opportunity for us nationally and at the local, with the territories, the provincial governments, and the local actors to actually look into securing those minerals, exploiting them, and both contributing to national defense and ultimately our economic prosperity. So I will just leave it at that. But thank you so much again for the invitation.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thanks for everybody who tuned in. The conversation will continue. Take care.